Hello everybody. We're going to do something a little bit different today. I ostensibly wanted to use this video to talk about my experience watching the Napoleon film that recently came out. Myself and the gaming club went down to the cinema in. I actually went to Canada to go watch the film in Abbotsford, and we spent our money and off we went to go watch Napoleon. Now, just for context, sorry, the dog's rolling around in their bed over here, so you might hear her snuffling from time to time. For some context, this is a group of wargamers who are, most of whom are in their 60s, if not 70s, ardent Napoleonics fans, so very much in the, not button counters by any means, I will add, but very much the sort of historically minded lot who, when they see an opportunity to see a film which purports to show history, going to jump at the opportunity to do so. So off we went, and first of all I'll say I had a wonderful time. I can't remember the last time I've been to the cinema, so it was really nice having an opportunity to just enjoy the old big screen experience, which as I say is not really a thing we do anymore, what with streaming and all. Anyway, so we went to the cinema, we bought our tickets, we had a good time. There were 7 or 8 of us. It was a rather last minute plan. We planned to go later in the month, but turns out films don't run as long as they used to. So we kind of did a bit of a rush job, got in there Monday night and watched the movie. First of all, I was prompted to make this film by Ralph's video, which he released earlier today, about, historical reality in films, and I think a lot of what he said is very valid. So I think the comments he made about symbolism are very meaningful. It's funny, he talked about the scene in the Robin Hood film that Ridley Scott made, where it looks like sort of a D-Day landing with the White Cliffs of Dover and all. And I, ridiculous as the scene is, and I don't like it very much, I understand the sort of the thought that went into creating something like that, in terms of how it symbolically evokes the sort of D-Day landings kind of in reverse, if you want, if you will. So I totally get him on that front. The Napoleon film, I think, suffers from several things. First of all, a movie about Napoleon, I suppose an audience expects it to be about this great historical figure, and also expects they expects it to cover certain things. So I think if Scott had made a film which had not covered Waterloo, or didn't show it or anything like that, or any of his military campaigns, people would have been even more outraged, given that Napoleon is largely remembered for as a great military leader. Certainly the battle scenes were very gory, which at times felt a bit over the top, but it didn't feel like the core message of the film. It felt like what the film was really about was Napoleon's relationship with Josephine, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? It's fine if that's the film that Ridley Scott wanted to make. That's great. The problem is you can't then promote the film with the battle scenes and such, and sort of sell people a sort of historical war epic, when really it's about a relationship between two people. So in terms of its like historical value, in the sense of like what does it teach us, because realistically for most people in the public, this is going to shape rather their impression of of who Napoleon was and what he got up to, right? And there's no mention in this film about the Napoleonic Code in terms of law, the good things he did, the metric system, some of the reforms he made. There's none of that. Instead, it seems to pivot on this idea of Napoleon as a slightly sort of emotional, temper-prone little tyrant, right? And I feel as though it doesn't. It kind of doesn't really do the bit of historically informing people particularly well. So there are, I hate to say it, but I feel like the people who see this film with zero context and zero knowledge of Napoleon are going to come away with a very, I would say, very shallow and very incorrect understanding of who Napoleon was and what happened in the period, right? But okay, let's set that aside for a moment and let's ask ourselves, its historical errors aside, was it an enjoyable film? Was it at least a decent film? Just as a film, let's ignore for a moment that it's about a historical figure. Let's assume that Napoleon is a totally fictional character. All the events we saw were entirely fictional. None of it ever happened. Is it at least a decent film, right? And I think, again, this is something that Ralph talked about. He said how he really enjoys the film The Patriot, even though it is horrendously historically inaccurate. And I agree. I think what The Patriot succeeds in doing is helping us understand what would motivate the Americans to revolt against the British, right? So the film, for instance, has this very heavy-handed way in which the British redcoats come through the countryside where Mel Gibson's character lives and burns the farmhouse down, and there's a sense that they're not winning hearts and minds. So even a very shallow reading of The Patriot sort of tells a story of the reason the British lost the colonies is largely due to their own doing, right? They alienated the population, and by unleashing people like Tarleton upon them, and kind of alienated the people that they were trying to keep in the empire. So shame on them, and good for the hero character. And then so I feel as though the sort of the historical inaccuracies sort of fade into the background, because the theme, if you will, of the story is more to do with liberty and so on, and the idea that Britain alienated the American populace from itself by its actions, rather than it being so the Mel Gibson character, it doesn't start the film on a war footing, wanting to go and fight the British. Quite the contrary, he doesn't want to get involved. And so I felt that was quite an for all its faults, that's actually quite a good way to tell the story, if you will. So yeah, it's a good film. It's fun. You take it for what it is, and that's okay. So you say, right, well, the history might not be all there, but it gives people a relatively decent understanding of the dynamics of the War of Independence, and some of the things that happened. But it also is just a fun film, and it's well made, and we can enjoy it for what it is. Now, contrast that with Napoleon. I feel as though it didn't, to my mind at any rate, it didn't really communicate what the problem with Napoleon was. Well, I felt there was a really weird decision they made at the end, which was, at the end of the film, they kind of put the number of people who died at Napoleon's big battles and how many people died in his retreat from Russia almost as like a butcher's bill, to sort of nail home this idea that he's almost like I don't want to be that heavy-handed, but like a Mao Zedong or a Stalin or a Hitler figure, where his greatness is measured in a body count, right? And that just seemed particularly tone deaf as what you take away from the story of Napoleon. Okay, so that seemed really a really odd choice. So not quite sure what Ridley Scott was trying to do there. But then the question I asked after the fact was, okay, well, if as history it's rubbish, which I feel it is, what do we do with it as a film? Does it have any redemptive qualities just as a film? Just for the record, these are some Franco-Prussian French guns that I'm painting at the moment, and these are the artillery crews. So I'm going to try and get some of those done this week. And then I have these. I've just finished up pretty much these 6mm Polish tanks. These are the 7TP single turret models. I managed to get the camo pattern to my liking. I might dab a little bit of a highlight on the I don't know if you can see it, but on the brown, just to brighten it up a touch. But other than that, quite happy with it. All right, back to the thing. So the question is, does the film redeem itself, even just as a film, right? So forgetting for a moment that it's about Napoleon, let's just say it's a film about a fictional person called Napoleon who never existed. There was no Waterloo. What do we think of the film? Well, this is the problem. It doesn't feel like a particularly well-made film either. For somebody of Ridley Scott's caliber, we expect more, I suppose. But it felt really, some of the acting felt a bit wooden. I think Vanessa Kirby was certainly excellent as Josephine. She was certainly very very good. And there were moments when Joaquin Phoenix was, the caliber of actor that we're used to seeing him be. But on the whole, it didn't feel like a particularly marvelous movie. The exception to my mind was the soundtrack, which was at times bizarre in terms of its choice of musical themes, but still quite good, I felt. So, for instance, there's a piece of music, you can see this on the official soundtrack on, like, YouTube will be able to play it for you. It's called Austerlitz Kyrie, and it's Kyrie eleison done in a style that melds Greek Byzantine chanting in the Orthodox Church and Russian Orthodox chanting, which are different, right? They're chanted in two different languages, but the musical style is also very different. And it almost has a sort of Varlam monastery quality to it, which I thought was quite magical. And then this piece of music gets used throughout the film at several junctions, and I thought that was rather smart. That was quite a nice piece of music. It gets used at Austerlitz first, but it also reappears during the Russian campaign. So it has a sort of like I said, like a motif-like quality in the sense that it reappears at several points, and a very tragic sound to it, to the way that it is made and the way that it is chanted. So I thought that was rather snazzy, and the soundtrack in general was quite good. I thought, not everything was quite as memorable as the Kyrie, but I thought the rest of it was still very good. So, it's not all terrible. And of course, the other thing as well is the costume design was absolutely stunning. Like, it was really nice to see, a good job on the costumes. So, I don't want to be totally negative. I just feel that some of the sort of creative decisions that were made seemed a bit bizarre to me in terms of storytelling, pacing, and the scenes that they chose. So, I'll use an example. It's not particularly spoilery. I mean, you can't really spoil a movie about Napoleon, can you, given there's a Wikipedia article about him, and if you're watching this, the chances are quite good you know who he is. The thing is, there's a scene in this where Napoleon's in Egypt, and he looks like they're excavating the bottom of a pyramid, and he goes to this excavation, and there's a mummy still in its sarcophagus, and the mummy gets opened, and then Napoleon goes to have a look at it, and then he grabs a box to stand on to look at square in the eyes, and then there's this kind of brief moment where he sort of stares at it, and then he's done. Right? Now, I was wondering what they did that scene for. I didn't quite understand, because I was like, well, in a film where Scott has to make some particularly rough choices, or not necessarily Ridley Scott, but where the editing process is going to be quite severe in the sense that there's lots of footage, right? With and tough choices have to be made about what stays and what ends up on the cutting room floor. And the thing is that that whole sequence is probably three or 4 minutes long, right? It's quite a long, very quiet scene. Nothing is said as such. Napoleon kind of has a look, and then that's the end of it. Now, I was wondering, what is the scene for? What does it do? What does it add to the story? And I suppose on one level we can read it as like Napoleon looks into the face of this mummified pharaoh and is potentially confronted with his own mortality, I guess, and this idea of legacy, or what you leave to posterity, and what it is to be great and to be remembered, and so forth. The other sort of slightly less charitable reading I got was the fact that when Napoleon wants to look at this mummy in the face, he has to get a box to do so, right? And it seems to me that this was kind of potentially a nod at the whole Boney was a short man kind of story that developed, that the British propaganda machine largely lent into. Sorry, there's a hair on this miniature and it's driving me insane. And we know, for instance, that whilst Napoleon was certainly not a tall man by modern standards, by the standards of the time, he was of average height, if not on the upper bell curve of the height spectrum. So we know that Napoleon wasn't exactly short. Obviously, that's part of the sort of enduring Anglophone perception of Napoleon, is this idea of him being this little short man who is a bit of an upstart in Europe. And that that seems to have persisted in the story. And the reason I can think that the editors decided to keep it in the film was to hammer home that idea, but it just seemed really unnecessary, right? It just didn't seem like it was particularly a smart choice, and it seemed like time that was wasted that could have been used on something more meaningful or useful to the narrative or to the story. And that's what sort of bothers me in that whole scenario. So anyway, as I said, there's some bizarre choices made, wasting time. It felt like there were lots of scenes which lingered a bit too long. They needed to be a bit snappier because you're trying to cover a very grandiose story, and it just felt like there were moments that could have been more economical in their use of time, and we could have got on with the story and just had a good time, right, and actually enjoyed the story for what it was. Yeah, so I guess, as I said, as a film, I don't think it was particularly good. Just as a film in and of itself, the music was pretty good. Or at least the Kyrie, the Austerlitz Kyrie was memorable. It's still stuck in my head, but I suppose it is just Kyrie eleison, so, but the style of chanting was quite ethereal, or not ethereal, but you know what I mean. It was kind of interesting. But yeah, the rest of it was quite forgettable. I will not be watching it again. What I will do, however, is when the promised extended edition comes out, the director's cut, so to speak, I'll be curious to see what differences exist. So I'll probably watch it when it comes out on streaming, just so that I can, compare notes and see like what decisions were potentially taken out of Scott's hands. But yeah, not the greatest film. There were a few other bits and pieces that were quite cool. There was a scene I liked, which was slightly ridiculous, but there's a scene where Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, meets Napoleon, and people have said, "Oh, well, that never happened," and it's like, well, it doesn't really matter if it didn't happen. It could have happened. That's one thing. To Ralph's earlier point that he made in his video, is that it could have happened, and it's interesting. It's a good way of dealing with a situation, because you want an English character to speak to Napoleon and tell him, like, listen, everyone here is really curious about you, but you can't stay in England. We have to send you to St. Helena. Somebody has to deliver that message to him, right? And of course the problem is, if you keep adding more and more characters, people get confused. So there's a sort of storytelling shorthand where you know who the Duke of Wellington is. He has just defeated Napoleon in battle. So now what we do is we use the same character as a sort of just as a stand-in for whoever's going to deliver the message, to tell Napoleon, by the way, you can't stay, you have to leave. We won't let you set up as a country squire here in England and keep you in exile. We're going to send you to St. Helena. And that was quite an interesting way to tell the story, and I felt it was quite good. And the other thing I really liked about that particular scene is he's having breakfast on board HMS Bellerophon, and he is enjoying it immensely, and he comments on why they have such a great navy, because the food's good, which was a nice little joke. And then he's got this captive audience of young midshipmen who are all fascinated by him and hang on his every word. And one of the Royal Navy lads makes a comment that, like, they're totally enamored of him, these young midshipmen, right? And I think it's probably one of the few parts of the film where they make this effort to try to describe to some degree the magnetism of Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's from relatively humble roots in Corsica, managed to become first consul and then Emperor of France, right? And you don't do that, I don't think, by being a wooden, curmudgeonly, uninteresting person. You do that by inspiring loyalty in people, right? Like, in everyone around you, the people who support you politically, your soldiers and all that jazz. So I feel like that moment where where it's made clear that this man is fascinating, and that these young men are totally taken with Napoleon, is actually quite a good scene. And now, whether or not the scene happened is absolute nonsense. It doesn't matter if it happened or not. From a storytelling standpoint, it's actually a very good mechanism to convey an idea, which, if you were to simply deliver it in a form of exposition, would be rather dull or boring, right? So I thought that was quite a smart little moment, and I feel it was kind of one of the highlights of the film, because it sort of really hammered home the idea of people's loyalty or people's fascination with Napoleon. And that, he must have been quite an interesting character, I would imagine. So yeah, I thought that was quite good. It's again, we'll wait for the extended edition. We'll see what happens there, and if there are any meaningful changes that are made to the story that changes its tone potentially. But you never know. I mean, with these things, I feel like these historical films are always a balancing act between the fact of the story and the fiction of good storytelling, and I feel like there is a good compromise to be had. I think Braveheart's great in storytelling. It doesn't really modulate the historical elements or the truth for me very well, even on a sort of thematic level. Whereas I feel like the Patriot does a good job of being both an entertaining film and a fun film to watch, and yet also conveying thematically why the story would happen or would have kind of happened in history, even if the actual events being shown are not particularly historical or true to history. So yeah, there we go. Those are my thoughts on the Napoleon film. Again, it's a way more fun watching a movie like that with your friends, because you get to then have a natter in the car on the drive home about what you thought was good or bad about it, and so that's always a good laugh. So we had a nice chuckle there, particularly at Napoleon's love-making skills, which again, probably just again are part of this kind of the sort of very Anglophonic or Anglocentric reading of the telling of the Napoleon story. But I'll leave it at that. Good time at the cinema, lots of fun. While I have you here, I also want to quickly talk about something which came up in our conversations the other day, after we watched the film, or on the way to the film actually. We talked about Waterloo, and we were discussing how to create historical scenarios that kind of are good. I don't know, words fail me there. And the reason we talked about it was that the club has run, in the last 20 odd years, they've played Waterloo 5 times, and every single time the French have won. Napoleon never loses. And it brought to mind an interesting conundrum, because first of all, the French players understand all the shortcomings of Napoleon's plan for the day, so they can preemptively fix all of that, right? The next thing is that because the Prussian player is delayed, and their arrival is it's not that it's necessarily known, but it can be planned for, which again the French likely would not have had as much opportunity to plan for. But also it's where you have to separate the tactical and the strategic, right? It's like Napoleon might be winning the field on a tactical level. I mean, it's a stalemate presumably by the end of the day, but the game is still in balance. It's the fact that the Prussians turn up where they do, when they do, in the numbers they do, which makes Napoleon's position strategically untenable, and essentially means he has to cede the field. That's something that a war game isn't very good at doing, right? Because you have a finite number of turns, and so the French player might say, "Oh well, we won because we defeated the English in detail." And then the Prussians turned up and we were just mopping up the English, and so we've won. Whereas, it's sort of irrelevant whether Napoleon wins the ground there, because the position his army will have been in and the hits he would have taken will diminish the army. But I mean, be that as it may, the thing that was interesting was the way in which the French players, every time they play this scenario, overcome the problem of loss, which is that they form a grand battery and basically pound the British line on the ridge into absolute oblivion, and of course they don't charge the English infantry with their cavalry, and there's certain mistakes that were made they just simply do not repeat, and with hindsight it's very easy to be a general and to do these things. And so we were talking about, like, how does one model a scenario like that actually makes it a fun game to play for both sides, where you say, actually the French can win this, but it almost feels cheap to allow the French players to simply just not make any mistakes because they know what's coming. And so I think to some degree you may have to actually mess with the order of events, or where the Prussians turn up, or add some sort of randomized elements that take the foreknowledge that the French or the Allied players have away from the scenario, so that they can't bank on the fact that they know where Blücher is going to turn up, or they know where, when he's going to turn up, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, we had a little chat about that, because we're I suspect probably very soon we'll play in 2025. Probably we'll play Waterloo again, and thinking about it now, when or if we do, I would prefer it if the game were more of a contest. I think the descriptions I didn't play those games, but the descriptions they gave us seemed a bit sort of the way they described it seemed a bit kind of unfun to play. But then also obviously it comes down to the players at the table on the day potentially doing stupid things too. So I don't know. We'll see. But it was just a thought that occurred to me, because next year we're planning on doing a sort of refight of D-Day. I think 3 of the beaches potentially, maybe more. I'm not sure. But it's going to be in 20 mil. I'm not going to contribute too much by way of miniatures, because I don't really do 20 mil World War II. But the club has very substantial collections for that, and they play Rapid Fire Reloaded, I believe. And so there's obviously this. If we're doing that, then that raises this question again. I mean, I think in a sense the Germans can't really win, but whatever the victory conditions are will be set for the Germans rather. They will have to play to those victory conditions, right? So even if it's not a case of necessarily being able to win as the German player, again, knowing what the Allied force is and so on, provides them with a piece of information that likely commanders on the ground would not have had on the day. So I always wonder, like, to what degree we can kind of spoil our own fun by sort of knowing too much. But then I suppose part of what makes wargaming fun is to take the historical scenario and actually subvert it. So there you go. Other than that, this week I've been working away from home. I'm about an hour and a half, 2 hours down the coast, so I've been commuting rather than staying down there, just because it's nice to be able to be home. And I am in the process at the moment of I'm on a bit of a small scale kick, or binge, if you will. So I just want to get some 6mm stuff done, and I want to get these Franco-Prussian things done as well. I'm experimenting with guns at the moment, because I've not done much artillery. And I found out that these French limbers would have been green, so I'm actually using Phlegm Green from Wargames Foundry, and then I'm just sort of highlighting going up from the shade color 28A up to 28C, so I get quite a stark highlight. But at 10mm, that stark highlight actually works really nicely. It's quite jarring at 28mm, because you really notice the gap between the highlights. But I will say for the smaller scales where you want a bit of pop, it's actually quite nice, because it really aids that sense of the miniature just exploding in color at various points. So yeah, having an absolute blast with this 10mm stuff. Really like it. It's such a great compromise, I feel, between 6 and 15 and 28. Like, it just gives you just the right amount of detail so that it looks like what it's supposed to look like, while at the same time being quite being quick to paint, and that's a very virtuous thing for miniatures to be, is quick to paint. I've really been enjoying watching the Krauser Collection's videos, his 15mm stuff, and just seeing that, and then also Ralph's 18mm Crimean stuff that he finished up last month. These are the sort of things where you look at that and you think to yourself, as a hobbyist, I can do that. That's actually within reach, because at that scale you don't have to be Golden Demon winning painter, you can just get on with it, and a sort of tabletop ready paint job actually looks really, really good. It doesn't have to be, you know, super finely highlighted and so on. And I've been thinking a lot this week about, you know, how we spend our time in the hobby. And I've said in the past that I kind of paint for joy. I paint as much or as little as I feel of a miniature, to the standard that I feel like doing, because it's my hobby and I can do what I want. And that's sort of where I am at the moment, is just, you know, I'm trying to find a happy medium in my 28mm stuff where I feel like I'm making the progress I feel like, because I want to play with these pieces, right? But by the same token, that I'm also, you know, presenting the miniatures in a way that I feel is consummate with my skills. I don't think I'm a particularly great painter, but what I mean by that is, you know, I would be embarrassed putting very poorly painted miniatures on the table, because I know I can do better than that, right? So I have to strike this happy medium between the two, where I compromise between, you know, miniatures that would take me forever but would look really, really great, and miniatures that are you know, that are quick to paint, but are kind of 70% as good as the really good stuff, because there's a diminishing returns here. Like, if an absolute top-notch model is 100% of effort, you probably don't really notice that much in terms of the scale from like the 70% of perfection to the last 100%. You likely don't notice that from 6 feet away, or from a foot away, and then you probably don't notice sort of 20% before that. So from 50 to 70%, that detail and that effort is kind of lost to the eye when you look at them at 3 feet away. And the more I play with the guys at White Rock, who play very much in the Grand Manor style, very large armies, beautifully painted. Well, I say beautifully painted, they look really great en masse. The more I've come to recognize the fact that I just don't pick up miniatures and scrutinize them closely. I just don't do it. I'm not interested in that. Because they're not centerpiece figures, right? They're not supposed to be looked at that way. You look at them and you get an impression of, wow, that looks really great. And when you stare at them too long, that's when you start seeing the wrinkles. But again, when you're playing a war game, it just doesn't matter. So yeah, very much enjoying that. And I've been listening up to the painting phase, which is the channel where Peachy from Games Workshop ended up, with two lads. And actually, that's been really insightful as well, because they're advocates of that kind of way of thinking. So yeah, enjoying that very much. I'm gonna love you and leave you now. I'm gonna try and get the uniforms done on these guys tonight rather, and then hopefully by the weekend we'll have the guns done. That'll be quite nice, wouldn't it? So I'll catch you later. Thanks for watching. Ciao now.